Hi, this is a procedure to take apart and replace bearings on a pitch motor from GE, model number FP9-4001. I'm Jason Strohmeyer.
And I'm Heston Knighty.
And we are first year students at Northeastern Junior College in Sterling, Colorado. If you are technically savvy or in the industry and just need a quick refresher on how to do this, the following is the written procedure. You can just pause the video at any time, screenshot, or save the picture, however you can do that, and we will not judge you not watching the entire 32-minute video. If you do need some further help, feel free to stick around and watch the video. There's a lot to learn in it. Thank you. Flip burger 2, flip burger 3. Are you guys ready?
Yep.
We good? Get out of the way.
Hear the difference? Nice.
Heston, you're standing right where the key would shoot off.
Oh. That's good.
Okay, so this is tool list. We're gonna need a 10mm socket and ratchet, a Allen wrench, 6mm, another Allen wrench for 7/32, a bearing puller with an 11-inch base with 8-inch arms, another bearing puller with a 7-inch base and 6-inch arms, an Allen wrench at 3mm, 2 flathead screwdrivers, an Allen wrench that's 3/32, a flathead punch, a hammer, an 8-inch breaker bar with an 8mm socket, 1/2-inch socket, 3/8 deep well socket, needle nose pliers, snap ring pliers, 3/3-inch rubber mallet, and a heat system so that the bearings can reach at least 220 degrees Fahrenheit. 1/2-inch deep well. So you're also going to need a 3/4-inch socket for the 11-inch bearing puller, a 9/16 socket for the 7-inch bearing puller, and a 3/8 drive to 1/4-inch drive adapter if needed. So materials that we need are shop towels for cleaning, WD-40 for lubrication or cleaning purposes, a 6305 RS bearing for the brake side of the pitch motor, a 6306 RSC3 bearing for the work side of the pitch motor, 4 5/16 by 18 thread by 2.5-inch bolts, and a 6 by 3 by 1-inch block. Electrical tape. Need steel-toed boots, safety glasses, and heat-resistant gloves.
Alright, so step 1, we are going to use our 10mm socket and wrench to take off 2 of the bolts holding on the fan housing.
And loosen these.
and loosen the other two. Step 2, now that it's loose, we are going to gently lift the fan up, and there are 2 wires that are going to be clipped together. We will unclip those by just simply pulling them apart. Take the fan, move it off to the side. Save it for later. Step 3, we're going to unlatch the rubber cover and remove that. Step 4 is we are going to disconnect the 2 wires inside from the brake. Once they are disconnected, you can then pull them out.
One at a time.
Step 5, we are taking our 6mm Allen wrench and removing the 3 bolts holding the brake on. Step 6, we are using a 7/32 Allen wrench to loosen the 4 bolts holding the spacer in place. However, we are only loosening them just enough to create a little bit of separation. Our goal is to loosen them without actually running them into the brake pad so that they don't damage that.
Hold on, let me get this.
So after loosening the bolts just enough, we've created some separation here so that now we can push the spacer back against and fit a bearing puller in there. Using our 7-inch bearing puller with a 9/16 socket that fits on our bolt, we're going to remove the brake disc. Using a 3mm Allen wrench, we're now going to loosen but not completely remove the set screws holding the gear onto the shaft. Once again, we're using our 7-inch bearing puller with 9/16 socket to now remove our gear off of our shaft. After the gear is off, we're using a 3/32 Allen wrench to remove the 3 screws holding the encoder into place. They're very small, going to fall off very quickly. So be careful to save them right away. Next, using 2 flathead screwdrivers, you have to take off the E-clip that's holding the encoder onto the shaft. Be careful not to pry this open. If you do pry it open, it is made to not go back into place. Also beware, they may go flying. Now with the encoder and encoder ring loose, you can just wiggle this off the shaft. If not, you may need to use 2 flathead screwdrivers to pry it off the shaft. After the encoder ring is off, you now have this final thing to remove. It has 2 set screws, 1 and 2, that you use your 3/32 Allen wrench to remove, to loosen but not remove completely. Once the set screws are loosened, you may be able to wiggle it off. If not, you might have to use a bearing puller to get it off your shaft. Using a flathead punch and a ball peen hammer, any kind of striking surface will do, you're going to go directly at the shaft key on a slight upward angle and tap it to loosen it. The goal is to do as little damage as possible to the shaft key. You can see it slightly raising up. And doing as little damage as possible, you're able to completely repeat the process on the other side. Now we're going to use our 8-inch breaker bar with an 8mm socket to go in and get that heater out of its locked position. This can take a lot of patience, and you have to move, because it's such a tight area, you may have to turn the screw only 5 to 15 degrees at a time. This is the little bugger that can take upwards of 20 to 30 minutes if you don't have the right tool to get out. Now that the heater's out, we're going to remove the bolts that have A1 and A2 labeled on them, and that is because they're attached on the inside to the faceplate. So when we pull it out, we need to pull this guy out along with the faceplate. We're using a 1/2-inch socket to undo the washers. Once they're loose, you can just unscrew them. And then you can push the bolt through. And make sure that it's free out of the housing. Repeat the same step for A2.
You want to make sure to have a wood washer right there. so that it doesn't arc through the casing.
Alright, we've now flipped to the other side of our housing to remove the faceplate. It's 8 bolts located in these holes. We're using a 3/8 inch deep well socket in order to get to them. After they are loose, we're going to use needle nose pliers to remove them completely. While loosening, we're keeping in mind that we need a star pattern or a cross pattern to make sure that we're evenly removing pressure from the faceplate.
Now we need
With the bolts removed, you can now try to wiggle off the housing. If it doesn't wiggle off easily, you can always use an 11-inch bearing puller with 3/4 inch socket. To grab onto the housing and use the shaft for leverage to remove the housing, the faceplate. The housing is free. And now you can see our first bearing covered by a snap ring. In order to remove this bearing, we need to get rid of the snap ring. The snap ring, we're going to use a pair of snap ring pliers, and we're going to squeeze together to free this ring. And as you're squeezing together, you have to pull it out. Now that the bearing is free to be removed, we're taking a rubber mallet and a hammer. We have a dead blow hammer here. If the bearing is easily moved, we can just tap it or push it through. If not, you may have to tap lightly with your dead blow until your bearing comes out. Once we have the bearing free of the load side, we're now going back to the brake side, using a 1/2-inch socket to remove the 4 bolts on the brake side faceplate. Again, remembering to cross pattern our loosening. So to make sure that we don't put uneven pressure on the housing. Once all 4 bolts are removed, you may be able to wiggle the faceplate off. If not, you may be able to use 2 flathead screwdrivers to pry beneath. And if still that doesn't free enough, you may have to resort to a bearing puller to get it off the shaft.
You might need.
Because our bearing is stuck in our housing, we now have to use our 11-inch bearing puller to remove the faceplate. The last turn. Good.
Yep.
And this right here is why we said we had to make sure that these were through our housing. Once again, we're using our 11-inch bearing puller to get the bearing off. It could be a one-man job, but it's a lot simpler with 2. Now that we have both faceplates removed, we can now pull the rotor out from the load side because the fan will not fit through the stator. And we're going to pull that out, remove it very carefully. At this point, our hitch motor is completely disassembled. So it's a great time to inspect, clean. That's why we have shop towels, WD-40. Clean up anything that needs cleaning before we reassemble with our new bearings. All right, we've gone through and cleaned up as best we could, all the parts. We still have to clean up that external area, but we'll get to that later. Now we're going to actually reinstall bearings. First, we're going to start with the housed bearing on the load side. In order to install the 6306 RSC3 bearing in the load side housing, we are going to put it on as straight as we can. Then we're going to use our block of wood and our rubber mallet to lightly tap it down into place. Some force may need to be used. The idea is to get it in as straight as possible. So as you can see, lightly is a relative term, so we now have to use our mallet and a dead blow to get that thing into the housing. Once it's in, it needs to be set all the way down so that we can re-put in the snap ring. Once the bearing is in place and seated in the housing, we now have to reinstall the snap ring using our snap ring pliers. So again, we're putting them in a position where we can squeeze and we are very careful to protect our eyes in this situation. There you go. To reinstall the brake side shaft bearing 6305 RS, we are simply heating it on a heat source. What we're using is just your coffee pot warmer. And once that's warm, we're going to take a leather glove because it's going to be about 250 degrees. And we are going to take it as quickly as possible and shove it on the shaft before it shrinks back to its normal size. Perfect. It's seated. If for some reason you fail at this the first time, you can always use a bearing puller, pull it off, reheat it, and try again. Now that our bearings are swapped, we have fresh bearings on both the brake side and the load side housing. What we need to do is we need to reassemble it in exactly the same opposite order as we disassembled. There are 2 additional steps that we need to pay attention to that we will take you through when we get to them.
So we are moving the brushes out of the way so that we can get it around the bearing on the brake side of the pitch motor in order to get it setting back to where it was originally.
There's one.
Be sure not to touch the brushes with your fingers because the oils on your hands will destroy the brushes.
About it, and I'll just.
We are putting the brake side faceplate on using the 2.5-inch bolts that we brought, and using the brake washers and the original washers from the 2-inch bolts that put it on. We are sucking the plate onto the bearing to put the bearing in the housing.
We were previously mistaken.
to
The washers
keep
are
a
actually insulating washers from
star
A1,
pattern.
A2, S1, and S2.
So that sucking it in doesn't break the plate. So we are taking the bolts out to replace them with the original bolts. Start with the bolt with the 4 original washers and the one right across it to keep pressure on the other 2 sides.
You may need to take one of the other 2 bolts out so that you can suck it in further to get the last bolt in. As you can see, we're having trouble with that one right there.
So all we are doing is reinstalling the original 2-inch bolts so that we can suck the brake side faceplate off or on. We are following a star-like pattern. And once this is done, you just put the rest back together, backward from the procedure. Now that the bearing is in the housing, we just need to put the brushes back in there. Just by pushing the brushes down with the screwdriver. We may need to use the needle nose to readjust the spring tensions.